When you look at a point in two-dimensional space, well, let's look at 2 points. Here's a point over here. Here's a point over here. I'm going to call this point 1, 3. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to call this -3, -1. If we want to look at the midpoint between these, your midpoint is a point, first of all, of course. Halfway between 2 points. Now, one of the interesting things is that you can determine the x value completely separately from determining the y value. The x value for this point is exactly halfway between the x values for these points. To get a number that is halfway between 2 different numbers, the x for the midpoint here, to get a number that's halfway between 2 numbers, you want to average the x values of the endpoints. And of course, to average 2 numbers, you add them together. So I'm going to add -3 and +1 and divide by 2 because there's 2 numbers. This is -2/2, which is -1. Excuse me. So it looks like the x value for this point is at -1. To get the y for the midpoint, you get the average of the y values at the endpoints. So if we look at the y values, -1 and 3, you notice that this x is lined up here, or this y value rather is lined up here. This one is lined up here. This one is halfway between. So if I take the 2 y values, -1 and 3, and add them together and divide by 2, I'm going to get 2/2, which is 1. So the midpoint is at -1, 1. Your formula to get a midpoint between 2 endpoints is always to take the 2 x values, add them together and divide by 2 to get the x value, and take the y values, add them together, divide by 2 to get the y value. So this is how you get a midpoint between 2 points. The distance formula is a lot more complicated. For the distance formula, we make use of the Pythagorean Theorem. You know, on the Pythagorean Theorem, if you have a right triangle, a triangle with a right angle, and you label the 2 shorter sides A and B, and then the longer one we call the hypotenuse, label that C, that the squares of the lengths of the legs add up to the square of the third side, the hypotenuse. Well, when we're looking in space like this, we can always draw a right triangle between 2 points. This is making the assumption they're not already lined up horizontally or vertically. So if this is the point x1, y1, and this is the point x sub 2, y sub 2, then the distance from here to here is going to be this distance squared plus this distance squared will give you this distance squared. So here's our A, here's our B, here's our C. This is the point x sub 1, y sub 1. So it might be the point 1, 2, or whatever. It could be negatives, it could be irrational numbers, anything. This is x2, so this is x2. Notice that this is also x sub 2. This is y sub 2. The distance from here to here, let's say this was 1 and this was 7. What's the distance between them? Well, 7 minus 1 is 6, of course. So the distance here is going to be the difference of the two x values. The length of this side is going to be the distance between these two y values. So you just subtract them. So in place of a squared plus b squared equals c squared, we know that a is going to be x2 minus x1, so we're going to square that. B, this distance, is going to be y2 minus y1 squared. You don't have to worry about the order here because you're going to square it, so it's going to come out positive regardless. And instead of C, I'm going to call this D for distance. So this would be D squared. To solve this for D, I just take the square root of both sides. So for instance, if I was asked to find the distance between 3, negative 4 and 2, 6, the distance is the same either direction. So I can call this one x1 and y1, and x2 and y2. And I would say the distance is going to be the great big humongous square root of, subtract the x values. So 2 minus 3, and square that, plus 6 minus negative 4, and square that. So this is going to be negative 1 squared plus 6 minus negative 4 is 6 plus 4. So this is going to be 1 squared is 1, negative 1 squared is 1, plus 10 squared is 100. So the distance is the square root of 100. Now this is your exact distance. If you want the approximate, use a calculator. It's whatever the calculator is going to give you.